my dear students of class 8A and 8B. Today, the same lesson, the revolt of 1857. I am going to explain about the role of the British Parliament, the role of, the British government regarding the repression, regarding the oppression, regarding, the suppression of the revolt of 1857. And what did they do? Actually, after the suppression of the revolt of 1857, the British took initiative in order to provide certain facilities to the people of India, and also to make a very responsible government in India for doing better work in the country. That's why they did some necessary steps, and then these steps are: number one, appointment of Secretary of State, appointment of Secretary of State, appointment of Secretary of State, Indian Council. These are the 2 points. First, I am going to explain you appointment of a Secretary of State. Under which circumstances had the British appointed a Secretary of State? The British, appointed a Secretary of State from a British cabinet. A member of the British cabinet was appointed as the Secretary of State. When, under which circumstances? When the revolt of 1857 was suppressed. Only during that time, a member of the British cabinet was appointed as the Secretary of State. Now, it was decided by all the members of the cabinet, British cabinet, after a long discussions with other responsible members of the British cabinet. They came to a conclusion that there should be one Secretary of State for India to look after Indian affairs, so as to make it sure that the people of India would be treated equally, impartially, not partially. That's why they decided to appoint a member of the cabinet, a member of the British cabinet, to be the Secretary of State for Indian affairs, and according to which they also decided to make one council named Indian Council. They also decided to establish one council for whom? For the Secretary of State, in order to assess the work of the Secretary of State, and in order to assist the work of the Secretary of State. One Indian Council also was made. It was for the convenience of the Secretary of State. And since the Secretary of State was answerable to the British Parliament, that's why the Indian Council also was formed. It was the British Parliament also was given. Also, a British Parliament also appointed an Indian Council to advise whom? To advise the Secretary of State. The British Council, the Indian Council was appointed. One Indian Council also was formed and started working in order to advise the Secretary of State. So these two things the British introduced for the people of India in order to avoid further rebellion, further agitation, further uprisings in India. And they also decided to remove all kinds of misunderstandings between the British and Indian people. That's why they appointed a Secretary of State, and for the assistance of the work of the Secretary of State, one Indian Council, whose main work was to advise the Secretary of State. So these are the 2 points, my dear students. Then my next point is that, appointment of British soldiers. appointment of British soldiers, appointment of British soldiers, and increasement of no, not increasement, decreasement of Indian soldiers. The British appointed a number of, British soldiers. They decreased the number of Indian soldiers in the British army because the British left all hopes on Indian soldiers. They realized it that many Indian soldiers were there who were conservatives in nature, and that's why at any time they might start another rebellion, another agitation, another uprising in the army. That's why they started appointing only British soldiers in the British army instead of Indian soldiers. And those who were working, basically after the suppression of the revolt of 1857, many Indian sepoys were dismissed from the British. Rest of them who were still there, who did not get themselves involved in the revolt of 1857, still 57, they also were dismissed from the British army. Why? Because the British did not have any faith on the Indian soldiers, and hence they started appointing a number of British soldiers in the British army instead of Indian soldiers. And next point, point number 4. Point number 4, another important, that is very important point, that is, this point is very important. Protection of the traditional rights, protection of the traditional rights of the zamindars, traditional rights of the zamindars and landlords. Zamindars and landlords. The British decided to safeguard the interest of Indian peasants, farmers, as well as Indian zamindars, Indian landlords. Earlier, the condition of the peasants and farmers had become very miserable before the revolt of 1857 started against the British. The condition of the peasants and farmers had become very miserable, especially the conditions of the poor people, those who depended on their profession, like artisans, like craftsmen. They all lost their jobs because of the competition, because they could not monopolize their trade. Neither they could monopolize it, nor they could meet their expenses, because their trade, their income, occupation was totally abolished by the British. How? Because the British manufactured goods, the finished products of England, flooded Indian market, large market of India. As a result of it, those artisans, those craftsmen who depended on their handicraft industries, cottage industries, small scale industries, their occupation, their job was totally gone. That's why they all became jobless people. At the same time, the landlords and zamindars who were creating problems for the poor people, especially landlords, money lenders, and the people who had some little acres of land, they were losing their lands. Their condition became miserable only because of some landlords and some zamindars. But during the Sepoy Mutiny or revolt of 1857, a large section of zamindars, landlords, they all remained neutral. They did not take part, they did not cooperate with the Sepoys. Why? They did not cooperate with the Sepoys with money, but they non-cooperated with them. A number of soldiers requested them that by saying it that it was their first war of independence against the British rule. They would like to overthrow the British rule from India. They needed their cooperation, but there was none to help financially to the Indian Sepoys. So those landlords and zamindars, they not cooperated with the British, cooperated with the Indian Sepoys, but played a negative role. The British observed their activities. The British had been observing their activities, and at last, after the suppression of the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, the British decided to provide them some special concessions and reward. They adopted a policy of reward and punishment. Reward for the peasants, reward for those who cooperated with the British, reward for those who remained neutral, and punishment for those who fought against the British and cooperated with the Indian Sepoys. That's why the policy of reward and punishment encouraged Indian jamindars, Indian Sepoys, and those landlords, those talukdars who also remained neutral. They also were given special privileges by the British. So, in course of doing this kind of act, the British decided to protect the traditional rights of the zamindars and landlords. The British decided to protect the traditional rights of the zamindars and landlords, and they all were satisfied with the British system introduced for them. Another point that is also important, that is, that is also important, point number 5. Last point number 5, appointment of Gurkha, Sikh and Pathan soldiers in the British Army. In my previous point, I taught you about that the British decreased Indian soldiers in the British Army, and instead of Indian soldiers, the British appointed only British soldiers. That is true. But at the same time, it is also true, the British appointed only soldiers from 3 communities of India, from Gurkha, Sikh and Pathan. From Gurkha, Sikh and Pathan. the three communities of India from where the British decided to appoint soldiers in the British Army. Why? Because these three communities of India, Gurkha, Sikh and Pathans, they were remained neutral during the revolt of 1857. They did not get themselves involved in the revolt of 1857. And by doing it, they cooperated with the British government. That's why the British government decided to appoint Indian soldiers only from three communities of India, from the Gurkhas, the Pathans, and the Sikhs. At the same time, the British also increased the salaries and other allowances and other facilities for the soldiers of India, and they also removed all kinds of contrasts between the European soldiers and Indian soldiers. That's why these three communities of India, Gurkha, Sikh and Pathan soldiers, were benefited with the newly introduced system of the British up to this, my dear students. Thank you.